All right, good. Okay, so like I said, hello everyone. Thanks for joining the webinar. Harjeet Judge, part of the customer experience group. As a group within the development organization, we're going to be covering some BI4 for deployment best practices today. And looking at the agenda, we'll start off by talking about some best practices and tips and tricks that you need to follow when deploying your web tier as well as your intelligence tier. We'll then move on to talk about deploying and configuring of your processing tier. And in this section, I'm hoping to do a demo if everything goes well. And to close it all off, we'll look at some examples of high availability and load balanced BI 4.1 systems. We should have some time for Q&A at the end as well, but like Adrian mentioned, please feel free to use a chat window to ask any questions, and the subject matter experts that are on this call should be able to answer those questions for you. So before you go deploying a BI 4.1 system, a few things you need to understand before you do that. First, BI 4 is a 64-bit architecture. So in XI 3.1 and earlier versions, processes were limited to use a maximum of 2 gig of memory, while BI4 processes are designed to take full advantage of the 64-bit architecture. So in the BI4 world, the processes are no longer limited to that 2 gigabyte limit that you see in a typical 32-bit architecture. Second, BI4 is also architecturally different than 3.1, and what I mean by that is if you look at the XI 3.1 environment and some of the client tools that were part of that XI 3.1, the majority of those client tools were developed with their own connectivity stack, and while in BI 4.1 we have what's called the common semantic layer, and pretty much any of the client tools that you would see in BI 4.1 would leverage that semantic layer. So in addition to that, we made quite a few significant enhancements to our connectivity to BW. So a couple examples of that is in XI 3.1 and earlier versions, if you wanted to connect to BW or report from BW, you would have had to install the integration kit, and it was a separate installation. You no longer have to do that. That integration kit is bundled with the BI 4.1 install. And also, with BW connectivity, we now offer BIX connectivity as well from various client tools such as Web Intelligence as well. There are also many more services that you would see and applications in BI 4.1. So don't expect to be able to run your BI 4.1 system on the same hardware that you may have used to run your previous versions of the BusinessObjects products. So performing a sizing exercise or using the sizing estimator tool is very, very critical before you can deploy your BI 4.1 system. And my colleague Carlos covered the sizing topic in quite a bit of detail in the previous webinar. So feel free to check out the webinar page that Adrian had mentioned before. There is recording available that you can look at to get some additional insight into how to size your system. Broadly speaking, when we look at the BI platform, we can basically split it up into 3 categories. First, there is what we call the web tier or the application tier, and this is where you would have your web applications deployed on Apache Tomcat or some other third-party supported application server. With BI4 or BI 4.1 installation, we bundle Apache Tomcat by default, and we deploy all of our web applications on that Tomcat web application server. And on the intelligence tier is where you would find the CMS and the FRS servers. And at a very high level, the intelligence tier is responsible for managing and storing all of your objects. So it's responsible for maintaining the content in the CMS database and also on disk. It's also the system that maintains the security information for your BI 4.1 system. And the processing tier is where all the action happens. So requests from applications are processed here. So the processing tier goes in and fetches the data, does a lot of aggregation, and then sends the results back to the client. Okay, so looking at we're going to look at the web tier deployment in a bit more detail and what are some of the best practices and some of the optimizations that you can do on the web tier side. So just some background, if you were to look in your XIR2 system and you go in and launch just try to access InfoView, and if you were to run a tool like Fiddler or some other HTTP traffic monitoring tool, what you would see is we would launch approximately 130 requests or 130 HTTP requests just to bring up that first page. And the amount of data that we would be transferring to the client is about 3/4 of a megabyte. So that's represented by the byte received number that you see on the screen here. If you were to do exactly the same workflow in XI 3.1 and launch the InfoView page, just a home page, what you would see that the request count goes up slightly, but if you look at the byte received, that number pretty much doubles in XI 3.1. And the reason for that is because we made quite a few enhancements to the functionality that's available in InfoView in XI 3.1. So for example, the addition of the right-click menu, the right-click context menu to be able to schedule and do a lot of other functionality was some of the enhancements that we made in XI 3.1 that weren't available in XIR2. So with that, we added a lot more bytes that were being sent, or a lot more data that was being sent to the client machine. So comparing all of this with BI 4.1, again, if you look at the request count here, it pretty much doubled here. But if you look at the byte received, it's actually smaller than what you would normally transmit to the client in an XI 3.1 system. And the reason for that is because we also added content compression to the data transfer that's happening to the client. So the actual amount of data that's coming is less to the client than you would see in XI 3.1. So I'm just showing you all of this just to kind of highlight the need for some web tier tuning in your environment. So with BI 4.1 or BI 4.0 system, we ship the default Tomcat Web Application Server component. And Tomcat has a built-in HTTP plugin that can also be used to process static content. However, what we recommend is that you use a dedicated web server component like Apache or an IBM HTTP server that allows for additional benefits or additional optimizations, such as caching of JavaScript, caching of images on the web server itself. So if you're not using a web server today in your deployment, you should really seriously consider planning to implement one web server. So the benefits of implementing a web server far outweigh the cost, and the process is documented pretty extensively on SCN. One of my colleagues has written a pretty extensive SCN article, and the link to that SCN article is actually available on the screen here, and you can actually click on that, and it'll take you to the article, and you got a lot more details about how to actually configure Apache with Tomcat. So when you add an Apache web server, what you essentially can do is you can use the wdeploy tool, and you can do a split deployment of your web tier. And what I mean by that is you can split your dynamic content and your static content. So all the static content would be hosted on your Apache web server, and all the dynamic content will still be hosted on your Tomcat application server. And if you do that, what we've seen in our testing, we've seen approximately a 25% improvement in actual navigation when you go to the BI Launchpad portal and navigate around. You'll see much better performance with that split mode, where you have the static content on the web server and dynamic content on the application server. So just a couple other things worth mentioning on the slide here is the embedded application server is limited to about 500 active concurrent connections, and there's also limits on how much memory and how many threads you can have on a single instance. So if your sizing requirements go beyond that, you're going to need to stand up an additional web tier node. And also, if you have a single server web tier node today, and you're constantly seeing 80 to 100% CPU utilization of the web tier, that's also an indication that you need to add additional web tier nodes in your system. What you'll also notice in BI 4.1 is with the default Tomcat is that BI 4.1 is leveraging SAP JVM for the embedded Tomcat application server. So the version of SAP JVM that we're using at the moment is Java 6, but we've found again with internal testing is that Java 7 delivers quite a few significant performance improvements, especially around the startup time, as well as garbage collection for multi-core CPUs. So we're looking for customer feedback on possibly implementing Java 7 with the BI 4.2 release. But until we get to that point or get to that stage, we do support Java 7 with Tomcat. So you can update the JDK that you're using for your Tomcat on your own. And the final point that I want to make on this slide is to make sure that you're also allocating ample heap space to the Tomcat instance so you don't run out of Java heaps on your web tier. So that's all I'm going to say about the web tier deployment. We'll start talking about the intelligence tier here. So as I mentioned earlier, the intelligence tier contains the CMS server and the file repository servers and also the CMS database. The install of 4.1 will install the SQL Server or SQL Anywhere DB. But for production scenarios, you should really be using an external database for your CMS database. A single CMS server can host up to about 400 to 500 active concurrent requests. So your chances of ever needing more than two to three CMSs in your environment are actually quite slim. And you also don't want two CMSs on the same machines, right? So the best practice is to deploy the CMSs on separate nodes, so you have failover. So if one CMS goes down, the other CMS on a different machine can actually take over and still process your requests. The file repository server performance is heavily dependent on disk I/O because when we store BI content, we store the content on disk, and it's the file repository servers that are responsible for retrieving that content. So you need to make sure wherever the file repository servers are running and wherever you're storing that, the FRS or wherever you're storing your repository content, the disk I/O on that specific server is good because the file sizes that we retrieve and write to that file store can be quite large. And likewise for the various databases that we connect to, such as the CMS system database, as well as the auditing and the monitoring database, should be very, very close to wherever the BI platform is running. Okay. And the central management server is the brains of the entire BI system. And any bottleneck at the CMS level or at the CMS database level can have a huge impact on the operation of the entire environment. So when the CMS database, when the CMS server communicates with the database, it updates a lot of information such as metadata, it verifies security, so it does a lot of queries. So you want to make sure like I mentioned earlier, the CMS database as well as the CMS server are fairly close together and they're tuned correctly. And the CMS server uses a pool of connections, which is something you can configure in the CMC. So the server needs to have sufficient number of database connections to run those queries that it's sending to the database in parallel. So in older releases, this number was set via the command line, but like I said, that setting can now be configured in the CMC. And the default setting for BI4 is 14 connections or 14 active database connections at any given time. And you can actually set it to as high as 50 connections if your database supports it. But prior to you changing this value, you should really be checking with whatever database that you're using, whether it's Oracle or SQL Server, to make sure your Oracle or SQL Server database can support those database connections as well. So the other property that impacts the CMS performance is the number of objects held in memory or in cache. And reading from memory is much faster than reading from the database, right? So in prior versions of this product, in XI 3.1 and older, this value was configured at about 10,000 objects, and which quickly resulted in CMS swapping objects in and out of cache. So in BI 4.1, we've changed that value to be a default of 100,000 objects. So a higher value translates to a higher memory footprint of the CMS server. And you can look at the metrics for the CMS to identify how many objects it's actually storing in cache and what are the total number of objects that you actually have in your CMS, in your system database. So if you only have a small number of objects, the chances that you'll ever need to increase this value is quite slim. But if you have millions of objects in the CMS database, then it might be worth it to increase this number, and you can set it to a number like, say, 250,000 as an example. But keep in mind, the higher the value, the higher the footprint on the CMS, so that at some point you may or may not want to increase it to much higher than 250,000. Okay, looking at the processing servers. Here I'm gonna briefly talk about the adaptive processing server and some of the configuration things that you need to think about when you're sizing your processing server, your adaptive processing server. And I'll also switch gears and connect to a BI system where I can show you a demo of the system configuration wizard as well. But I have just a couple slides here to show you first. So by default, the adaptive processing server, which is a process in BI 4, it's like a Java application server essentially, because it is a Java process. But we have several services running inside this APS. There's closer to about 20 or 22 services that sit inside this APS. So when you deploy your instance, the default deployment or a single server deployment of BI4 is fine in a dev or test environment. But if you ever want to move that, if you ever want to set this up in your production environment, you need to make sure that the adaptive processing server is split and it's into individual components. So those services that are part of this APS are posted on their individual adaptive processing server rather than all being in a single APS. So that's where you can use the BI sizing guide, also the sizing companion guide to really look at what are some of the optimal parameters that you should be configuring on the adaptive processing server when you go through the process of splitting it up into its individual components. So you may be asking yourself, what do I even need to split up the APS? There's a few reasons for that. Like I was saying before, you have 22 services running within a single Java process, and they each serve a different function. Right? Some are used for web intelligence, some are used for processing workflows with analysis OLAP. So if you ever run into a scenario where you need to troubleshoot something, say you have an issue with Webby or you have an issue with a OLAP, if everything is running on the single APS with all the services there, it's going to become very difficult to troubleshoot. So that's also one of the reasons why you want to make sure you segregate your processes according to the function that they're serving. And also, once you start adding a lot of services, the heap space or the Java heap space that these services are going to use, you'll have to configure that heap to be much larger than you would want. So if you set a heap space on a Java process to say 32 gigabytes, you don't necessarily want that. You want to actually split it up into smaller chunks so you can allocate a smaller heap space for those services. Okay, and to make it easier for you to configure the adaptive processing server, we've created this tool called the System Configuration Wizard, which is available in BI 4.1. And I'm just going to stop presenting here, and I'm actually going to show you this tool and how it works. And if you have any questions, we can discuss them after when the presentation is finished. I'm just going to be logging into the central management console here. So first, I'm actually going to show you what I was talking about with the adaptive processing server. So if I click on servers and click on server list, I'll get a list of all the services that are running in my environment. So the adaptive processing server is just one of those services. And if I right click on it and choose edit common services, I can see the list of services that are part of that APS. So in this case, this is a default deployment of BI 4.1, and you can see the list of services that are part of this APS, right? So this DSL bridge service, for example, is a service that's used by Webby if you're using Webby against UNX universes. It's also used for when you're connecting to BW using the BIX connection. The multi-dimensional analysis service here is used for processing a OLAP request. There's also Platinum Search service, which is used for actually indexing the content in your BI 4.1 environment. So you can see that this one APS is hosting services that are, meeting different needs or different use cases. So you don't necessarily want to keep them all under a single APS. In addition to that, if you look at the properties of the adaptive processing server, if I right-click on this and go to properties, you can look at the command line. And to make it easier to read, I usually copy this whole command line into Notepad, and we can look at some of the parameters that are set in the command line of the APS. So one of the key parameters that you need to usually tweak is this XMX setting, which is basically, this XMX setting parameter, which is your Java heap space that this process can scale up to. So depending upon what type of workflows you're going through, so if you're running analysis OLAP workflows or if you're running Webby against BIX, we usually recommend that you set this heap space setting or this XMX setting to 8 GB. Some of the other parameters that are also important is this parameter called heap dump on auto memory error. So if you're not sized correctly in your environment, what you'll see in your BI 4.1 system is you may see a lot of heap dumps on disk caused by the APS because the APS is running out of memory. So one thing you can do is you can disable that from happening. So if you're running out of disk space or something on the server, you can take this parameter out from the command line. So the APS, every time if it ever gets into a situation where it crashes because of memory errors, it will not dump anything to disk, and you can save the precious hard drive space that you might be running out of. You also have the option of changing the path as to where it's writing the heap dump. So if you're looking to do some troubleshooting, you can actually save it to a network share or some other drive which actually has more space. Okay. So those are the parameters that I wanted to cover from the APS. Now let me show you the system configuration wizard as well. If I go to the CMC homepage, System Configuration Wizard is just an application that's available that I can launch. And you have an option of choosing whether this comes up first time you log into the CMC. So if you unselect this, you'll have to, if you unselect this option right here, it would only show up, you would have to go to the CMC page and explicitly start up the System Configuration Wizard. But if you have this checked, when you first time you log into the CMC, the System Configuration Wizard automatically comes up. So I'm just going to click Next here. So here I have an option of picking which services I wanna start in my cluster, right? So I'm not sure if you noticed, but in my previous screen when I was looking at the list of servers, my Explorer services were stopped. So the tool is smart enough to know that the Explorer services are not running right now. Do I want to start them by default with the system, or do I want to stop them? Right. So here you can pick and choose which components you use in your environment, and you can decide to only run the components that you need. So for example, if you're only running web intelligence reports and you don't care about everything else that's here, you can uncheck any of these options here and just only keep web intelligence. And what the tool would do is it would configure the system to only start the services that are relevant for processing those web intelligence reports. Okay? I'll leave the analysis piece checked here as well. So I'm going to click next here. So now you have an option of picking your deployment template on how you want to split up your APS. If you leave it at extra small, it will just basically leave the default deployment, which is a single server deployment. But if you click on small, it's going to end up splitting up your APSs into 4 APSs. And the way you can tell what it's going to create for you is if you look at the deployment template. So here's the deployment template for small. So what it will end up doing for me is it's going to create 4 APSs. It'll create an APS called core APS with configured for 2 gigabytes of heap space. It will create one for auditing, configured for 500 megabytes. And then I'll configure 2 additional ones, one for data, for fetching data from, and also one for analysis. And it'll have the appropriate heap space allocated based on what you see in this template here. So if you choose some of the other parameters, it's going to create more APSs for you based on this deployment template that you see here. Okay? So just keep in mind that if you start choosing, a large system or a medium system, you need to make sure you have enough RAM on your system where you're deploying to be able to support the number of APSs that you're creating. Right? So in this case, I'm choosing a small configuration here or a small deployment template. It's telling me that I need 12 to 16 gigabytes of RAM to support that small deployment. But in this system that I'm working with, I only have about 4 to 8 gig allocated, 4 to 8 gigs of RAM on the system. So it gives me a warning saying that the template that I'm choosing is above and beyond the memory requirement or memory that I have on the system that's available. But I'll still go ahead and create the APSs for you if you choose to do so, which is what I'm going to do here. On this screen, what you can do is you can pick and choose where you want to write a lot of the different information that BusinessObjects processing servers use. So, for example, the input file store and the output file store, by default, it goes under the BusinessObjects installation directory. If you're looking to store your file store on a different server, such as a NAS, you can go in here and configure that. You can also configure where the system writes all the log files. So rather than having to go into each one of the server's properties and manually changing the path to where it's going to write log files and where it's going to write its temp data, temp working folder, you can configure that all at once for all the servers in your environment from using the system configuration wizard. Okay, so I'm going to leave this as default. So here you could just review what you selected. So in this first scenario, I chose analysis and web intelligence as the products that I'm looking to use. I chose the capacity of small, and I didn't make any changes to where I'm going to be writing my logs and whatnot. So no changes to the folder structure and where they write information. So if I click on apply, what I will do is I'll go in and configure my system based on the selection that I made. So let's hit apply. One other thing you can do while this is going here is you can download a response file, and in that response file what you'll have is all the configuration that you selected when you were going through the system configuration wizard. And what you can do is you can take that response file, and if you have other clusters in your environment that you also need to configure, you can use a batch script using that response file that you created from this tool to configure those systems with that batch file, rather than having to go into the system configuration wizard and doing it using the GUI tool. So it's telling me that it was successful, and if I wanted to download that response file, I can just click on that download button, and it will have all the information about the selections that I made when I went through this tool. So I'm just going to click close here, and I'll show you what I did in my system. If I go back into servers here, click on servers list. It might take a while because what it's doing in the background right now is starting up those services that I created. So remember I chose the small template for creating the APS or splitting up the APS. So what it's done is it's created 4 new APSs for me, and based on the template that I showed you earlier. What it's also done is it's gone in and stopped all the products that I don't want running in my environment. So I only selected analysis and web intelligence. So if you look at the services that are currently running, only the relevant web intelligence processing server is running, and it's also created an APS, analysis APS that's used for processing analysis OLAP requests. Okay, and all the other services that are not relevant for what I'm doing within the environment, such as Crystal or dashboards, it's shut all of those services down for me. Okay. That's all I wanted to show you. I'm going to go back and switch to the presentation again. So just some other things that you should be thinking of as well when you're deploying your BI 4.1 system. For lifecycle management, we usually recommend that you have your lifecycle manager server running on a dedicated node. The reason why we recommend that is usually for patching reason. If you come across any issue where the tool isn't working as expected, or your jobs are failing because of some product issue, you have the flexibility of patching your lifecycle management service or lifecycle management box independent of your BI 4.1 system that you may have running in your production environment. So you may not necessarily want to patch your production environment, but to address a product issue or what have you on the lifecycle management machine or the promotion management machine, you can patch that system to a higher patch level without impacting your production environment. Also, the security token service, which is used for doing single sign-on to BW, we usually recommend that you have that service on the same APS that's running the DSL bridge service. That's just something that we found over time when we have done testing. It just seems to work a lot better when you have it in conjunction with the DSL bridge service. The system configuration wizard doesn't actually do that for you. It puts the STS service under the core APS. So you should really take that APS, modify that APS, remove the STS service from the core APS, and add it to the one that's hosting the DSL bridge. Depending upon what you're doing, you can also disable auditing and monitoring just to reduce the load on the system. And one thing that I've seen cause problems in the past is the search functionality. So by default, when we ship the product, when you install the product, the search is configured to basically index full content. So what it will also do is it'll also index your universe content. So if, some of you may have experienced this, while the search is running or while the search is indexing, you will see tons of queries being sent to your reporting database. And the reason for that is because it's trying to index all the objects that are inside your universes as well. So we usually don't recommend that you index full content. So you should really only be indexing platform and document metadata, and you can uncheck the option to index universes. And that should substantially reduce the amount of memory that you need to allocate to the search service that's also hosted by the APS. And it should also alleviate the problem of you having your reporting database admin coming to you and saying, why are all these queries coming to my DB from your system? Okay, so just some other things that you need to think about when you're deploying. We touched on this already, but if your CMS database is not performing very well, it's going to have a huge impact in the BI environment. And the chances are that you're not going to necessarily know exactly where that performance problem might be coming from because you were focused on monitoring the BI4 environment, but the problem might be actually at the database level, the CMS database level. So you should be working closely with your database admins to make sure that the database that the CMS is using is tuned and performing optimally. I/O bottlenecks are also a huge concern, especially if you're having a lot of services that are hosted on the same APS. You need to make sure that the system or the server that those services are running on has ample I/O to support the load that you're putting on it. One thing we've also seen in the past is we could see significant performance improvements if you add some patches on your BW or add some additional SAP nodes on the BW environment. We've done some performance improvements on BW that also has a huge impact on how Webby as well as Analysis OLAP or some of the other client tools that connect to BW operate as well. So you'll see performance improvements across the board, not just on BW, but also on the tools that you're running from the front end. And if you're looking to host your BI4 environment in a virtualized system, keep in mind that you should have CPU and memory reservations. First of all, that's a key, and we discussed that in the previous webinar that we ran. But you also need to decide whether you want to be running, multiple processes on the same VM, and it's mainly because of disk I/O issues. So if you're running 5 Webby servers on a single node, you don't want to be running out of I/O capacity on the server. And usually in a VM system, what you'll have is one underlying VM host, but you have 5 or 6 or maybe even more servers running on the VM host. So if your full BI system, you may have 5 BI nodes, but if they're all running on the same underlying VM host, you could potentially run into I/O problems there as well. So you may want to split your BI 4.1 deployment so part of the servers go on one VM host while the other processing servers go onto a different VM host. Patching your BI system is also very, very important. We usually release a lot of stability and performance improvements with various service packs that we release over the months. So stay up to date. You don't necessarily need to be on the latest and greatest patch level, and you don't need to install every single patch that's released. If there's a specific issue that you need to address, you can install the patch, but we usually ask that you at least evaluate the support packs that we release every 6 or 7 months, so you're up to date and you're leveraging the greatest functionality that's available in those patches. Patching in the past used to be a bit of an issue because you had to patch one node at a time. With BI 4.0, SP5 went higher. What we've done is we introduced a concept called parallel patching, and what that allows you to do is do some parallel patching essentially. So you can patch your CMS servers first. So if you have 2 CMSs, you would install the patch in parallel on those CMS servers. And if you have other processing tiers, you could have 5 or 10 other processing servers in your cluster. You're able to install the patch on those processing servers in parallel, provided that you do the CMS servers first. In the past, you actually had to do each node one at a time. So we made substantial improvements in how you patch the environment as well, and it reduces the amount of downtime that you have to take when updating your system. So looking at some of the high availability and load balancing scenarios, when you're deploying a system, you have the option to either scale up or scale out. Scale up is also known as vertical scaling. That's basically adding additional hardware or resources to the machine that you already have. So that if you got 10 gig of RAM, 4 CPU, you scale that machine up to have 20 gigs of RAM and 10 CPUs or what have you. Scaling out is when you actually, acquisition a brand new machine, new hardware, and you scale out. You essentially set up a new server to deploy a different node of the BI system. And just what I was saying earlier about having multiple processes running on the same machine. So if you're scaling up, you really need to be careful about I/O bottlenecks, right? So if you have bunch of Webby servers running on one machine and a bunch of Crystal Report servers running on the machine at the same time, both of those processing servers are very, very I/O intensive, and they put a lot of load on the system in general. So you don't, in that scenario, it might be better for you to scale out rather than scale up. So have some servers running Webby, have a different node running your CR servers. And with the ability to virtualize now, it's so much easier to scale out now because you can easily start up a new VM. The whole concept of scaling out is much easier with the virtualization technology that's available now. So this is just an example of the default installation of a BI 4.0 system, where you have everything on a single machine. Your web server is on the web application server is on a single node. All your processing server, your intelligence tier, what have you, is also running on that machine. And you may even be using the same CMS database. So the default database that gets installed with the BI 4 installation is also hosted on the same machine. This is the simplest deployment you can have. So a user would come in, connect to your web application server running on that node, and all the processing would happen on that single node. Some of the pitfalls of taking this approach when you're deploying your system is obviously you don't have any disaster recovery. So if something goes down, if that host goes down, you're basically going to lose your environment, right? Unless you have backups of the server, right? And it will take you a little bit longer to recover from a downtime than if you had multiple servers in your environment. So this is another example that I've seen some customers do, where they have 4 or 5 different nodes all running the default installation of BusinessObjects. So that would be each node would have the default set of servers. They have a CMS on each one of these machines. That's also a big no-no. You don't necessarily want to be deploying like this. Having more than 2 or 3 CMSs in a cluster, unless you have a massive environment, doesn't really help you at all. In fact, it might actually degrade performance. So you shouldn't be running multiple CMSs, more than 2 or 3 CMSs, unless you've gone through a sizing exercise where you definitely see the need to have more than that. But usually 2 or 3 is more than enough for a mid to large size customer. So don't just do a default installation of the BusinessObjects environment on all of your servers and have all the processing servers running on every single node. What you probably want to do is something similar to this. This is what's called, we're scaling out essentially, and this is going back to the discussion that we had earlier, where you may want to have a web server hosting your static content, and you have a separate web application server hosting your dynamic content, and the BI server on the right-hand side that you see here is purely dedicated to the business intelligence processing servers. So that could host your intelligence tier, your processing server, but the web tier is separate in this scenario. Another example of a deployment scenario that you could potentially follow is where you have multiple web tiers, and you have multiple processing servers on the BusinessObjects environment as well. So in this case, you would have a load balancer in the front sending requests to a web server, multiple web servers, and that request would be going to a set of application servers that could be clustered as well. So there's session redundancy there, and those requests would go to multiple BusinessObjects servers in the background that are each hosting maybe a different processing tier. So in this example, the business intelligence server could be dedicated to crystal report processing. Some could be dedicated for web intelligence. Some could be for analysis rollout. So that's kind of the optimal scenario. That's what you would want to be deploying with if you have the hardware, and if you're sizing. When you go through the sizing, if you feel the need for sizing, and you have a requirement to have failover as well as high availability, that this is the type of deployment that you would be going with. Okay, that's pretty much all I had. So we can open up the lines for some questions and answers as well. And if there's any questions that are still pending in the chat window, I can try to address them now.
Thank you, Haji. Yeah, there are no pending questions in the chat window, and so this is the opportunity for everyone to post any questions you might have into the chat. So there's a question, Haji, from Claudia. do we recommend separate physical servers for web server and WAS?
If you could, that would be better. So if you have a separate server for your web server and a separate server for your application server, that would be ideal, but it's not mandatory. The web server by itself usually puts very little load on the server itself, unless you have a specific requirement where you may be going through a firewall. In that scenario, it might be better to have the web server sitting outside your firewall on a separate box, and then your application server will be sitting inside the firewall in your DMZ. And the number of ports that you would have to open would be just one single port that's used for the web server to communicate with the application server. In that scenario, you may want two separate servers, or if you have the hardware, you can put them on two separate servers as well. But the web server, like I said, it's usually a very lightweight processing server. So you will see definitely a benefit or an advantage if you can just install it on the same server where you have the application server running as well, just to leverage having the static content sitting on the web server and dynamic on the application server.
Okay, thank you. As a question from Dave Johnson, can we still use IIS instead of Tomcat, or is Tomcat preferred?
We don't support IIS at this point. You can probably still use IIS as a redirector to Tomcat, so where IIS would essentially be a web server in that case. I believe you can still configure that, but we don't support Tomcat. I mean, so we don't support IIS at this point.
Question from Matt: is 4.2 the same as 4.1 SP2?
No. So 4.1 SP2 is a support pack on top of 4.1. 4.2 would be the next minor release, so it'd be 4.2 SP0 essentially, if you will. Okay,
and a question from Jay: is it possible to store auditing data captured from CMC on a separate database?
Yes, you can. When you install the product, you have an option of picking where you want to write your audit database, and you can write that. You can pick a different database if you will. You can also configure that after the fact, after the installation from the central using the central configuration manager.
And thank you from Holbrook, T. Holbrook. How detrimental is it hosting both Tomcat and application server on one server?
If you could clarify the question, because to me, Tomcat and application server are the same thing. So if it was your question around the web server and an application server, I think I've answered that already.
Okay, he's typing again, or they're typing again. Question from Mohammed: can we create multiple instances of the same BI APS, example Web APS, on one host?
Yes, you can, but usually you would, rather than doing that, you would just increase the heap space allocated to the APS for that specific service. So, for example, if you're looking to have more than one DSL bridge service in a host, in a single server, with 8 gig of each, you might as well just keep one APS with 16 gig rather than having two.
Okay, question from Leandro: if a customer has, for example, 8 cores and a 32 gigabyte machine dedicated only for Tomcat, is it recommended to have a second instance of Tomcat in this machine?
Yeah, you could potentially do that. Yes, it would help with the workflows, like because we're by default Tomcat we talked about earlier. A single Tomcat instance hosts about 500 sessions, concurrent sessions, and about 5. You don't want to. It doesn't scale up above 5 gigabyte. So in that scenario, yes, you could potentially have a second Tomcat running on the same machine with a different port number, right? It would help with from a front end level, but it's not going to give you the failover or anything like that. So if your machine goes down, you're going to be losing both of your Tomcats there because they're all hosted on the same machine. But it may help with performance improvement if you add the second node, provided that the hardware would support that. Or not second node, but a second Tomcat instance on the same node, provided that the hardware is scaled enough to support that.
Okay. And question from Dave Johnson, is there a download link for documentation to install the product in a HA web farm?
I don't know if you have anything internally. That's usually something that you would get from your application server vendor, right? So if you're using WebSphere or WebLogic, they all have separate instructions on how you would configure them for high availability. I don't know if you have anything specific around configuring Tomcat in a clustered environment, but that's something you should be able to get just on the internet. There should be tons of articles available on how to cluster Tomcat. It's usually outside of the so that kind of information is usually outside of the scope of documentation or K-bases that we write internally.
Okay, so I think this is the reposting of the earlier question from T. Holbrook. Hosting your Tomcat alongside the SIA CCM on the same machine. Unless I misunderstood, I thought you suggested hosting Tomcat on one server and CCM on a second server, ?
Yeah, so by CCM, I assume you're talking about the processing servers or the central management server. The CCM is actually a utility. It's a client utility that you use to administer the BI platform. But I think I kind of understand what your question is. So you're asking whether Tomcat is on one machine, and then you have basically the BOE processing servers on a different machine. And we do recommend that you do that. If you have the hardware to do that, you'll see better performance, and also if you have everything running on the same machine, if there's a problem with any of the processes on that machine, it would impact other workflows as well. So the more you can segregate, the better, provided you have the hardware to do that.
Okay, and a question from Ravi Kumar, does BO 4.0 support HANA as a database for repository?
Yes, it does. I'm not exactly sure which version, though. So we'll have to get back to you on that one. I believe 4.1 does. I don't know if 4.0 does. And there's specific versions that you have to be on in 4.1 as well. So if you check the supported platform guide that's available on the service marketplace, it will tell you exactly which databases are supported, and HANA is listed, but I don't know which batch level you have to be on to be able to use that.
Okay, and question again from T. Holbrook. Are there any SAP white papers or best practice documents readily specific to BI 4.1 SP service packs? Currently, we are running BI 4.1 SP4 and are not live just yet, and would like as much info as possible to keep it running at its best.
Yeah, so there's tons of documentation. So some of those links were in the presentation that I shared. Splitting up the APS, there's tons of documentation available online. There's a document, pretty well-written document that you can utilize to do that. There's also the sizing companion guide that tells you some parameters that you need to configure on that adaptive processing server. So there's lots of information that you can look at specifically around APS splitting. There's some of the stuff that I talked about, splitting up your Apache and Tomcat and having static content having static content on Apache and dynamic content on Tomcat. That's also documented. Even changing the JDK to JVM7 is also documented. So if you search on SCN, you'll find quite a few articles documenting best practices around that.
Yeah, and just a further point on that, I will be publishing the recording of this meeting and the slides to the SCN calendar website. They'll be there in a couple of days, so stay tuned. And if you need that documentation or recording and its links, it will be there soon. So a question from Jasmine Cruz. What happens with the upgrade dashboard 4.1 SP2 going to 4.1 SP2? I'm not sure if that's correct. What happens with the connection, BIX connection? Not quite sure I understand that, but maybe...
Yeah, I'm not sure if I understand the question either. So maybe, Jasmine, if you can clarify what you're asking there.
Yeah, maybe you mistyped the releases, versions you were going from to. Question from Henry. Are there any docs for a DR environment setup, the whole setup, and suggested configuration?
I am not aware of any. Adrian, is there a way for us to get back to answering some of these questions later? I don't know the answer to that one. I don't know if you have any documentation around disaster recovery setup.
Well, I have the registered email addresses, so we could potentially, we can certainly get back to Henry.
Henry, if you email me directly as well, we can take that offline as well. I'll see if I can dig something up for you. And my email is just my email is just my first name dot last name at sap.com. So if you have questions that I can't answer, you can email me.
And we've gone slightly over the hour, but we can stay on to answer any questions as people want, and Harjeet has time availability. So there are a couple of other questions coming in. We can wait a few seconds. Okay, question from Srinivas. What happens when we upgrade Excelsius 2008 to Dashboards 4.1 SP4? How do we need to change the connections?
You wouldn't have to change the connections. You would. The dashboards that you currently have will continue to work once you bring them over.
Okay, and well, again, Srinivas, like BI services, as a follow-on to that. But
yeah, you could still edit those connections, right? Like BI web services connections, you'll still see those connections in your dashboard, right? When you try to edit the dashboard through BI4 SP4. I'm not sure why that would be any different. Maybe I'm missing something in that question, but if you're installing dashboards and you look at you import the dashboard in the client tool, you'll still be able to see all the connections that you have, and you can modify them to what you like.
And Kevin has submitted link for DR.
Thank you, Kevin. So Henry, I think the question about the disaster recovery setup has been answered. If you follow the link that Kevin sent, that should hopefully address it for you.
We'll wait just a few seconds more. It's still getting a lot of activity. So a question from Arun, is there any document for editing the batch file after downloading it from the system configuration wizard?
There isn't. You normally wouldn't want to edit the batch file, right? So, or the response file. What you can do is you can go back into the system configuration wizard and just run through the workflow and get another response file. It takes you about 1 or 2 minutes, and then you can just take that response file with the configuration that you're looking for and deploy it or use it to run on other instances that you have in your environment. I haven't seen any documentation specifically on what you need to do to deploy or change the response file.
So, okay, I just posted your email address for somebody who asked for it, Harjeet. And there's a question from Srinivas. Is there a new support pack? Is there a new support pack going to release? Is there a new support pack going to release? I think he's asking for when's the next one that's available. If you have any
SP4 should be coming out. I don't know the timelines around that. That would be, sorry, SP5.
Yeah, Tracy has actually posted the maintenance schedule. So
perfect. Thank you. Thanks, Tracy.
So there's a huge number of questions here. One thing I wanted to add is Harjeet is presenting our next scheduled webinar, which is scheduled for next Thursday. And it's more on BI 4.1 installation and configuration. So there'll be another opportunity to ask more detailed questions. In addition, as I said before, this presentation and its associated slides will be available from the SCN webinar calendar page in a few days' time. With that, I think I'd like to thank everyone for your attendance, and we can conclude this webinar. And thank you very much, Harjeet, for presenting. This webinar, again, will be the recording will be available in a few days from the SCN page that I showed in the chat window. Other webinars from the series are also shown in this SCN page. We'll be contacting you soon with invitations for the next webinar, which is presently scheduled for next Thursday at 7 a.m. Pacific time. And again, Harjeet is going to be presenting. Note that the webinars have now switched to a weekly frequency, and Thursdays at 7 a.m. Pacific is the usual default webinar time. Today's presentation on a Friday was an exception. So thank you again, everyone, and this concludes this webinar. Thank you, Haji.
All right, thanks, everyone.